an expert who will in detail dives into the challenges the supply chain industry is facing and the future direction of global supply chain. But before we dive into the session, let me start with the quick intro about International Development Institute, also known as IDI. International Development Institute is headquartered in Washington, D.C. area, and it's a leading training and capacity building provider. Working with private and public sector, IDI works closely with its clients in assessing their need to build institutional capacity, developing programs, and delivering them. In last 15 years of existence, IDI have trained thousands of participants from a number of countries. So at IDI, we provide capacity building, trainings and institutional strengthening program through short-term trainings, workshops, study tours, and consulting. And our courses, our programs are focused on strengthening human and institutional capacity through partnership and institute in all around the world. So basically, we provide our service in 4 different categories: the learning and development, policy formulation and advocacy, stabilizing institutional partnership, and conducting research and consultancy. And our programs are mainly focused on areas such as education, STEM, public procurement, supply chain management, school administrative leadership program, healthcare, port authority, and we also work very closely with local governments and federal governments in different countries. And let me move ahead, and before we start our program, let's set some ground rule. And please make sure to mute your phone, camera, or any beeping devices. That's really important. And also, if you have any question, please raise your hands, or you can use our Q&A box to just ask us questions, so we can ask those questions to our experts later on during the Q&A session. In case if you get disconnected from this webinar, please use the same link and we will let you into our meeting. Now, let me invite our expert who will be delivering the speech today. Is none other than Irvin Varkonyi. He's an MBA from the Thunderbird School of Global Management, and he's also a president of Supply Chain Operations Preparedness Education School. He teaches supply chain certification courses with APICS and holds faculty positions at University of Denver, University College Security Management, and Global Logistic and Commerce Program, likely George Mason University School of Public Policy, and American Military University. And he has published in Defense Transportation Journal and the Cargo Security. Now let me invite our speaker today, Mr. Irvin Varkonyi. Mr. Irvin, welcome. And you'll have 30 minutes to deliver your speech and your remarks on supply chain management and the things which is about the future of supply chain. The floor is yours.
I appreciate it, Roshan, very much, and I appreciate the IDI being to invite me to this presentation. Hello to all of you, wherever you may be in the world, whichever time zone you may be in. I'm currently outside the Washington, D.C. area, and it's a pleasure to be here and to offer some insight for all the good work that all of you are doing in international development. Let me briefly tell a little bit about myself. Let me make sure we can move this, and there we go. Okay. I think my international supply chain journey began as a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal in West Africa, where I served for 2 years in a rural development program. And I think that fascinated me about the world. So I pursued my MBA at Thunderbird School of Global Management, the top school for international global managers, if I may say. And that took me to a career in international business, working with airlines such as KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, Martin Air Holland, and Emery Worldwide, all that in the logistics area. So my career had been based in moving things and moving stuff all around the world. I then moved on toward consulting and teaching, and began certification programs which offer credentials in this field with organizations like the Association of Supply Chain Management, Scope, my firm, and then the last few years, well before COVID, looking at risk. And so I'm a member of the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium. We'll talk about supply chain risk and how it has changed our field of supply chain. So here I am now, looking at it, and again, it's been a great career, and I'm excited about all the changes that will be taking place. So we only have a few minutes, and so I'm not able to go through what I might do in a normal course in terms of describing all about supply chain. But what you can see here, I hope, is a visual that shows us the various steps that we have in supply chain. Supply chain management, a term that we now hear many people using, is really a comprehensive business solution approach which cuts across the entire development in an organization, its production and sales service environment. You can see here where we have a beginning, which is called product design engineering. In point of fact, it begins well before that, where we need to look at and business look at what do customers want, when do they want them, and how much are they willing to pay for them. We take that, we put that into our planning phase, and then we begin to design products. And from there, we source the products for raw materials. So we purchase them, and then we go on to actually make our products, and then we distribute the products. They go through multiple layers, and eventually they get to you, the customer. It is not a simple task to be able to coordinate and align all those areas, but essentially that's what supply chain seeks to do, is to combine all those so that at the end, the customer gets the product when they want the product, it gets the product at the cost that they feel they can afford to pay, and it provides the value that the customer seeks to have. A key aspect about supply chains, and perhaps what COVID has caused us to really consider, is that it became more logical for companies, instead of making all their parts themselves, to outsource them, or as you might say, to outsource offshore, so finding suppliers outside your country. That has brought tremendous efficiency and benefits to the businesses that are doing this, but also to the customers that use that, because that process made things more efficient and made things less costly. But what did it do? It made things more vulnerable as well. We didn't realize it as much in the 30, 40 years that supply chain has developed, but now with COVID, the whole world has begun to see that. So in terms of that, what is one of the great weaknesses that we have determined in supply chain is what we call the bullwhip effect. You see that on the right-hand side there, the slide, this oscillating line. I will explain that we call this the bullwhip effect. The bullwhip effect comes about when we have insufficient visibility or awareness of the status of our products within our supply chain. We don't necessarily know whether or not they're at the manufacturer's location, they're at a raw material site. We don't know. And the less that we know, or we might say the less that is visible, then the more decisions we make without proper data. And what happens to us when we don't have the right data to make decisions? We make erroneous decisions. And when we do that, we then order more than we may need. And when someone sees that we're ordering more than we need, they say, you know, maybe we'll produce more because we think there are more orders. You can see the effect of what's it's going to be. And suddenly we have this tremendous uncertainty in that. So we call that the bullwhip effect. It stems from not being correct in our forecasts. Forecasts, after all, are educated guesses. It stems from having lead times. Lead time is the amount of time it takes from when you want a product to when it's actually delivered. And we have found the longer it takes to have a lead time, the more error you can make. Price fluctuations can make changes as well. And at some point, then businesses try to guess, and what we call rationing and shortage gaming. We try to be essentially making more and more guesses. Well, all these are not very good if the world is volatile and if the world is uncertain, which we have seen in the last 18 months because of COVID. So what are businesses trying to do to try to reduce this bullwhip effect? Let's not make too many forecasts. Let's try and have a agreed upon forecast. Let's try and take less time to make a product. The less time you need to make a product and deliver the product, then the less chance you're going to be wrong. If your lead time is too long, then that can be errors. What if we have a pharmaceutical manufacturer who's trying to guess how much product to make for a market in Africa? The longer the lead time, the more the guess is subject to error. The less the lead time, the less subject it is to error. That's what we try to do by reducing lead time, trying to keep prices stable as well. So in doing that, if we manage to do this right, then this bullwhip effect that you see there will become smaller and smaller, and that's a positive thing. Unfortunately, we are trying to move ourselves toward that, and we'll see how successful we are. So what has been an impact on the volatility in supply chains? It is globalization. I do remember when being at Thunderbird in the 1970s, globalization really didn't mean much more than trading. We didn't manufacture in other countries so much. We didn't do that. We meant basically trading. But globalization began to take off in the 1980s and the 1990s. There were various trade agreements. For instance, when China joined the World Trade Organization, when we had NAFTA here in North America, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the European Union has not been around a long time. It really came about in the 80s. And all these meant that countries could now just not only trade with each other, but companies could go ahead and locate manufacturing in other countries and without having to worry about duties and taxes as much as before. So all this was great, right? It brought us new markets. It brought us new resources. It enabled us to have more and larger of a labor pool as well. So as we say here, defining globalization, the interdependence of economies globally that results from the growing volume and variety of international transactions in goods, services, and capital, and also from the spread of new technology. Much of this, by the way, of course, did occur before the internet, and it was evolving then, but you can just imagine what we're able to do once the internet became much more of a force in the 90s and what it has done for us. So that's sort of what we have done in terms of a brief description of where supply chains are, but every good thing sometimes has something behind it that we must be cognizant of. One of them has been written by a gentleman, a Professor Yossi Sheffi, who began to talk about the topic of resilience. Are organizations resilient? Is a company resilient? And by that, he would mean if there was a disruption, how quickly and how efficiently could that company come back to being normal? And that began to look at in his first book on that was in 2004. And we began to have some concern that maybe not every company is properly situated. And maybe what they are doing might expose them. But people didn't think too much about it. And why? Well, human nature is, sometimes we have an expression here, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Well, what happens if it's broke and we don't know it's broke? And more or less, he told us that things were broken, but we didn't quite realize it or feel that they very much were. So we didn't take too many actions, but he really began to make a change in our thinking. And he wrote more books on that. Then, upon the start of COVID, and actually shortly before COVID, he began to say that this COVID is going to expose us to many more things than we had experienced in the past. Are we able to deal with this new normal, or as he calls it in the title of his book, the new abnormal? So some of the things he began to say, and this book came out roughly toward the end of 2020. So which means we had about 7 or 8 months of data from COVID and its impact on that. And what we're beginning to see is that organizations now are changing or evolving, will create these systems where they're going to be much more capable to recognize and to manage large-scale disruptions. In the past, even though we had disruptions, and we all can recite the the disruption that took place in Japan, for instance, with the tsunami, the earthquake and the tsunami, or the Thailand floods, or hurricanes in the States. These disruptions, and while we knew those things could happen, we really weren't very well equipped to recognize that they're going to happen. He says companies now and organizations are going to be much more adept at being able to do that, because in a disaster such as COVID, such disruptions can not only hurt the business, they can destroy the business. And if they destroy the business, then the goods they make, like the pharmaceutical companies, those items will not be available to their customers. We're going to rebalance work from home. For those of us that have the ability to work at home, there'll be more of us doing that, which means the world of worker equity, the fairness among workers will change. Those who cannot work from home won't have the same advantages, and they'll have more risks than those that can work from home. And that's going to cause dislocation and dissolving or reducing equity among workers. We're going to see more of artificial intelligence and real-time data analytics. I'll explain in a couple of minutes more about artificial intelligence, but we're going to have a better ability to use data from events that have occurred to try and help us prepare for future potential events. In terms of being more proactive in supply chain, we're going to be working, and again, using more machines to help us, because machines and automation are more skillful than our individuals. And that's going to be a greater way for us to deal with dislocation. And we're going to rethink about offshore practices through greater diversity. So as I mentioned before, the trade agreements in the 80s and 90s opened up new trade between China and the world, the European Union, North America, and so forth. Well, we have gone to such a point where we focused a lot of our manufacturing agreements with suppliers in too much concentration. So if you have only one supplier in the world, and that happens to be halfway around the world, if there's a disaster, what will occur? So we are predicting that there'll be more diversity. And I think this is an area where many emerging nations will be able to gain advantage of. Is there any reason why we should not have more suppliers for various goods in African nations or elsewhere in Southeast Asia? By the more that we can diversify the supplier base, the less risk that we are going to have. So to me, I think this is a great economic opportunity for nations that we would call like emerging nations to be able to attract more business to their countries, because they will in fact be able to offer a more secure process of managing the supply chains. That I think is what's going to happen. There'll be a lot of work to do all that, but I think we can get there. I wanted to explain to everybody who may have had a situation, well, what is occurring in that now as we are recovering, somewhat in some countries, not so much in some other countries, and unfortunately the US, I think we may be backtracking a little bit, is what is it that's taking place in this new environment when we think that in fact COVID is behind us? It is not behind us. So what we've had is that we've had many millions around the world who have fallen ill and have died as a result of that. We've had many workers being dislocated in all kinds of organizations. So, but as we become then somewhat out of it, now demand is picking up. In other words, now that we feel things are better, we start demanding more. For instance, we want to buy more computers, or we want to buy more automobiles or other products. Well, all these need semiconductor chips. So guess what? During COVID, those who manufacture semiconductor chips reduced manufacturing because the demand was reduced. Now that demand is picking up, now there's a shortage of that, and now we can't get enough products. We show this in a graph with demand and supply. The red line there being demand, the blue line being supply. So at the moment, we're in a situation to the left on that graph, to the left of 1,000, where the red line is greater than the demand line. Now, when we want to have certain products, whatever they are, pharmaceutical products or other related products, there's not enough supply being made. Eventually, at some point, the two lines will meet and we'll have perfect equilibrium. And then what may also happen is then we'll have more supply than demand, which is to the right of, of the 1,000. So the bullwhip effect would tell us that we have wide fluctuations. What we're all trying to do in supply chain is try to minimize the fluctuations so that we don't have constantly over demand or under demand, but we try and have as much equilibrium as possible. Whether we'll be successful or not, well, we hope we will be, and we will see. But that explains it. So any of you who want to get some products and now find it takes longer, this is hopefully explains a little bit of that. So we're going to need some help in being able to correct this. And as I mentioned before, artificial intelligence will help us to be able to manage this a bit more efficiently. Artificial intelligence, also looked at as machine learning, will help take data that we've accumulated and putting that data together in a way humans are not capable of doing, of better predicting what the future will be like. So the more data that we can gather, the more we'll be able to predict what the future may be. It is not a guarantee. It is a forecast to an extent, but it's a forecast that's based on data. We'll be able to use that to predict the likelihood of disasters and the likelihood of the best responses. And to have this in supply chain, we use the term visibility. The more we can see items in the supply chain, then the more prepared we will be for those changes. All of you have experience in doing this. If any of you order items online through e-commerce platforms, when you've ordered a product, they will then tell you exactly when that's going to arrive, and you can go ahead and trace and track that shipment along it. That's what we call visibility. And the more visibility we have, then the better we can control the supply chains. So an artificial intelligence will help us gather data for such systems. What can they do for us? At the World Economic Forum last year in Davos in Switzerland, McKinsey company showed all the progress that's been made with respect to artificial intelligence. I apologize, I think this slide is slightly blurred. Didn't come across as well in the source that I had. But what it's doing is a couple of things, such as using satellite and data to predict areas that are at risk. Right now, we can get a picture of this, let's say of the Caribbean here off the United States, and we can now begin to predict where those hurricanes will be and what the effect will be perhaps of them. We can even go so far when we know that there's going to be disaster of where, what buildings, what facilities might be damaged based on the past. And if we know that, and then we know that there's a disaster coming, hurricane, earthquake we can't predict, but other ones, then we can take measures to refortify or strengthen those facilities that we can know by experience in the past have taken place. More on that is in terms of looking at what we can do for, let's say, evacuations. So let's say we're going to have, there's a hurricane coming off the coast of Texas in the United States, what path it might take. We can now be able to forecast what will be the evacuation routes that will be the best to do. This is not something that individuals can do, but machines through AI are helping us to be able to do that. And then as well in terms of what type of damage assessments we may expect. All this is important in the supply chain because the purpose of our supply chain is to try and manage it to keep it as safe as possible, as resilient as possible. Remember what Dr. Sheffy was telling us, that organizations need to become more resilient. And the more we can predict what disasters may occur, then the better actions we can take that will hopefully prevent them from having such a negative consequence. The pharmaceutical supply chains have had great damage as a result of COVID and manufacturing and global chains in general. In Africa, production has decreased by some 10%, which had a net value of about $50 billion has occurred because the supply chains impacted by COVID we're not able to produce, and we were not sensitive enough or sufficiently aware to be able to reduce that. There are now steps being taken place to try to reverse that and to grow the economy by better understanding such supply chains. There now is an agreement between the Pfizer pharmaceutical company, the one who makes one of the vaccines, and a South African firm called BioNTech, where the virus, the vaccines rather, made by Pfizer will be distributed by BioNTech. So Pfizer makes the large amount of the vaccine, and then the actual packaging and distribution throughout all of Africa will then be the responsibility of BioNTech. This type of work, more of it can be done. I have read where there are companies in Africa that are looking at making the various components that we need. So instead of importing vials and syringes and so forth from India, which is a very large in this market, that more of that can be done and manufactured by suppliers within Africa. So as I mentioned earlier, the diversifying our supply chain is an opportunity for emerging nations, and hopefully they will be able to take the opportunity of that to grow the supply chain and then to make their own countries that much more resilient. So technology will be coming in various ways to help us. What do we do when we can't get to countries or parts rather of parts of our country that are difficult? We use technology, and here we have drones. In the United States now, we have UPS, who is now delivering. It's one of our largest delivery companies, and it's a global company. Now utilizing, this is not a fake, this is not something in the future. This is an actual event taking place using drones. And that technology then can help supply chains to conquer, as we know, the last kilometer. The last mile is always the most challenging one, but now we have technology able to do all that. And certainly COVID is spurring that, because how do we reach people that that do not want to leave their homes, cannot leave their areas? Then we make and have difficulty using land vehicles. Well, now we have solutions so that we can meet the needs of those particular folks. Emergency supply chain, I would also like to mention, has very much become part of emergency of global aid, and the USAID, Agency for International Development, and now has prepared a supply chain playbook that is being used, so that we understand that it's not just simply countries donating money or products to other countries, but that a knowledge of and preparedness for such distribution is very, very important. So supply chain really has reached throughout everyone. International development, international business, all have supply chains to one extent or another. Supply chains don't just exist in the for-profit area, but they exist in the not-for-profit area, and certainly do exist in the NGO area. So supply chains really are a tool that we can use to improve our lives in so many different ways. The last slide in terms of the content here has to do with risk management. We don't have the time to go through all this. Suffice to say that managing risk and supply chain is just as important as managing efficiency. And we have 4 basic steps, as you can see here. How do we assess risks? Where could the risks be? Second part is then how do we balance risk against the cost? We cannot avoid every risk. We cannot just hope that it's going to go away, but we can balance it against the cost. And we need to find that optimum. In the past, we have tended to not do good risk management because maybe we thought it was too expensive. Well, we can see that COVID and its impact on supply chains did not make that a good proposition. Once we know how to balance it, then we actually do the work, the preparing work. We develop contingency planning and integrated. We use artificial intelligence, all that, so we are much more prepared for it. And then all of us in part of our supply chain will then share the risks amongst all of us. This is the process that we teach in our risk consortium. In the past, to be very honest, too many companies, organizations did not look at supply chain risk. They thought it's not going to happen to us. Well, it does happen, and it has happened. And now we believe that the interest is that much greater for supply chain risk. So those are areas that I work in terms of consulting and teaching now. I do wish this was better 20 years ago, because if we were better at 20 years ago, it's very possible that the effect of COVID, while not as much on people's health and conditions, that the economic devastation wrought by COVID, then maybe we might have been able to reduce that somewhat. Let me then just draw a conclusion on here, and I hope you have thought of questions, and you'll be putting questions in there. So technology for the future will be even more important than it is today. It is what's driving the evolution of supply chain and managing supply chain. Second, that the equilibrium in supply chains will still continue with bullwhip effect, but we have the ability to be able to narrow the spikes and the up and down. We don't have to have a situation where one day half the US is out of a certain product because we didn't think about it. We hope that will not as bad, but it will still continue for quite some time. That emerging nations need to leverage their role to be able to diversify supply chains. And I hope that countries, and many of you may be involved in them, are taking advantage of that, because that will bring economic well-being to those countries, as well as it will bring more supply chain risk mitigation to the world. Our knowledge and skills in emergency supply chains is growing, as you can see by what USAID has done and what for-profit business has done, and these skills and knowledge will continue to grow. And that supply chain risk management, I like to say, is the new hero. Not supply chain management that everyone's talking about, it seems, but supply chain risk management. And if you have good risk management, then you'll have good, efficient supply chains as well. I hope that was of interest to you, and we do have some time. So, Roshan and Lily, any questions you may have, I appreciate this opportunity to answer them.
Yes, thank you very much, Irvin, for that insightful session on supply chain management. It was refreshing to learn about the new trends. I was really intrigued by how you forecasted, how we'll be using more AI, artificial intelligence, data on making all these decisions. I do have a few questions here, which I will be asking you. So this is from Bivu, and the question is: will pandemic like this or COVID will make leaders to think away from global supply chain and focus more on regional supply chain?
That is a very good question. I think that I can answer by saying that just having a global supply chain and having single sources in parts of the world which may be subject to political or natural disaster disruptions, I think will encourage companies, organizations to have more of those suppliers. And I guess if more of those suppliers cover more of the earth, then they'll be more regional. So instead of a company being in just one place with suppliers, they'll have many of them. So yes, I think that in fact will encourage that. It will, and again, but the basic point of that is that we'll have more multiple suppliers. Rather than having fewer suppliers, companies will have more suppliers. And the more suppliers that you will have, the less risk that you'll have in your supply chain.
Okay, thank you very much. And also to our participant, if you have any question, please feel to type that in our chat, so we can pass that to our expert here today, to Irvin. So I have second question, and the question is: how can we make supply chain more customer focused?
Well, that's an excellent question. The purpose of supply chain management, and the reason that supply chain management has evolved as a discipline, is that there was a disconnect before we integrated all these parts. As I mentioned, the planning of items, the sourcing of materials, production, and so forth, that we tended to not be very customer focused. So the purpose of supply chain has been to become much more focused. So that rather than simply making a design and saying here's the best design now, all of you will buy it,
Mhm.
is that we try to do better at understanding what the customer needs and then designing products at a price that the customer feels there's value in it. So it is ideal, it's supposed to be more customer focused. If it's insufficient, that means we're not listening to the customer,
Mhm.
or that means we don't understand the customer, or that the customers have a wide range. Not all customers are alike. In fact, very few times are two customers alike. So to be customer focused, we need to better understand what the customer needs, will help us. Number two is to be able to better design the product the customer needs. The customer may not ask for the best product because they may not be able to afford the best product. So we need to understand where the balance is between cost and what the customer will need. And three is to be more customer focused, means to have less risk. So in other words, don't put yourself in a situation where you'll have to tell the customer, you know what, I put all my manufacturing with ABC company in this factory in Thailand, and there was a flood, so now I can't satisfy anybody. Manage your supply chain risk better, and if you do so, you will definitely be more customer focused. So hope those are three areas that you can see will improve customer focus.
Thank you very much. It's really important we understand our customer. Thank you very much. Now I have another question from Joey James from Jamaica. And the question is, how effective is the International Maritime Organization in ensuring that its member in the logistic and supply chain industry adopt new conventional tools such as green logistics?
Sorry, what was the last term on logistics?
Green logistics.
Green logistics. Ah, yes. Well, as we have seen by the I guess the distressing report that the United Nations issued, I guess it was just yesterday, or the day before, on that, companies are very much aware of being sustainable. Sustainable means many things. To a company, sustainable means that the company will stay in business for the future shareholders and future customers. Sustainable also means that it's the impact of companies on the environment will also be more sustainable. Companies are very much recognizing that that is taking place. To the extent that all companies and industries are enacting the most they can do, that I would say probably is not occurring as much. But it is really proper for governments in that sense to be able to step in and do those regulations. In the US, and I imagine from other countries, individual companies tend not to want to get too ahead of their competition. If I do something to reduce gas house emissions, but it might affect the price of my product and making me more expensive, I don't want to do that unless my competition is doing it. So I always like to say, as much as companies don't like to be regulated, in order to do the right thing, sometimes the best way is you make all of us do it. And when you do that, then we'll all do the right thing. You would hope that maybe doing the right thing is enough, but that doesn't often occur. So I certainly encourage more of that, and that I think the US is doing now more of that. We were backsliding there for several years, but now we are doing that. And doing all that, then industry will come together, and industry will find ways by working together to be able to be more sustainable, and hopefully, as the question asked, to be more green. I'm not as optimistic perhaps as I would like to be, but more so than I have been in a while. So there I am.
Thank you very much, Irvin. I'm pretty sure that the topic of green logistics will be more, we'll have more discussion on that specific topic in coming days for sure. Now, right. Let me move on to the other aspect which you were highlighting throughout your speech today about the data and the AI. So the other question is data a big problem, or is data a big problem or digitization? Can you give some examples of a specific effort put together anywhere to address this efficiently? Is data a big problem or digitization?
So if the question is data a big problem? It can be, but we are seemingly more and more able to gather data. There are many companies now that have come into being that are working with major organizations who gather data, and the way they gather data has become just tremendous because of internet, because of social media and so forth. There's a lot more real-time data that is being gathered. In fact, sometimes we worry about too much data, so much data that we can't decipher it. But there is so much more data available, much more in real time, but it's this artificial intelligence, this machine learning, that's really what's going to help us to manage that data before. Humans could not do all that. Not only could we not get all the data anyway, but we couldn't process that data. But artificial learning, artificial intelligence through things like machine learning, that it really is in fact helping us to gather more data and understanding that data and trying to decipher and throw out less important data. But it is still an issue because for many companies, they would still have to make investments in artificial intelligence. And I don't think I could say that all companies fully agree on the value of artificial intelligence. 5 years ago, most companies, you couldn't even define that. And now while people understand that, I'm not sure yet, at least the companies I'm aware of in the US, that really fully understand the scope of that. So I think that one still is to be decided in terms of how much data can be utilized and for this. I hope I answered that question.
Thank you very much, Irvin. I have two more questions. Yeah, like I said, if you have any more questions, please write in the chat, but I have two which I'll ask you. This is from Charlie, and he asks, how can we minimize escalating costs due to insufficient planning time and the urgency involved in saving human health and providing emergency product?
Can you repeat that question once more?
How can we minimize escalating cost due to insufficient planning time and the urgency involved in saving human health and providing emergency product?
So the USAID playbook on emergency supply chain management really puts in a lot of effort in being able to understand a particular need before the disaster comes up. So the planning before the actual disaster that we want to come up. So we gather data from previous events, and we use that data to better refine what our planning is going to be. Which means we have to look more so at what possible disasters may occur. We have to open ourselves up. We've been having these wildfires now, and I was surprised to learn, but I shouldn't have been, that what I thought was a U.S. phenomena, where we had huge and still have huge fires in the West, in states like California and Oregon, that we have having these huge wildfires elsewhere as well, in Greece and in Turkey. So the question I would ask is, were those emergency planners in Greece and in Turkey, did they have the forethought that in fact they could have such disasters? I'm going to suggest that they perhaps did not. That even though we talked about climate change, the fact that we could have such disasters. So the better way, I think, to answer the question is we need to expand our ability to look at what potential disasters may occur. And even if the probability is small, and usually by human nature, if something is little likely to occur, we tend to ignore it. I don't think that we can ignore that. I think that we need to look at any potential event or disaster that may occur, even if it's a low probability, and begin to prepare a plan for it. If we can do that, then I think when the disaster, if it occurs, and we hope, of course, that it does not occur, we will then be better prepared. So I think my conclusion on that is preparedness before disaster will in fact help us to minimize the time, so we don't lose time, and that would cause a human toll or loss of our economic benefits. That's, I think, is one way we can do that.
Thank you. Preparedness is important. Now, moving on, I think this will be the last question, and this is regarding supplier diversity. Supplier diversity is desirable, but a challenging concept to execute. So can you elaborate how we can overcome this difficult task of supply chain diversity issue?
I certainly can, and I wish that that Lizzie had given me 10 hours instead of 35 minutes. But she's tough on this one. So we have tools that can measure diversity. And the tools that we advocate for companies who may not have been considered before, if you have all of your eggs in one basket, in other words, you have one supplier making a widget, you can use tools. One of them is called the VAR, Value at Risk Tool. That tool says, if you look at a single source for a product and the risk that that source may be disrupted, here's the economic consequence. If, however, you have two suppliers, one here and one in another part of the world, and then you make the same economic analysis without going into all the numbers, what that will show is, in fact, the risk is reduced. Now, some will say, does that mean I'm going to pay more for it? You may have a slightly higher cost to make the product at two places, but your probability that you'll have a disruption is reduced, if not eliminated. Now you ask the question, what is it worth to your organization to have a disruption? If a disruption can be very damaging, then it is worth it to have two suppliers instead of one, and we have a formula that we can do for that. It's just like insurance. Do any of us like to pay for insurance? No, because we hardly ever use it. But what would happen if we didn't have insurance, whether on our vehicles or whether on our homes? If the event actually occurred, it would have far greater economic consequences than if we did have insurance. So we do have formulas and tools that you can do it to diversify that, to make that argument to a company and say, here's why it's better for you economically to have two instead of just having one. I've simplified that, but that's what it is. And that tool again is called VAR, Value Added Resources. And there are many other tools that we can use. So yes, Roshan, we have many ways to show in dollars and cents in black and white how we can do that.
Sure. Thank you very much, Irvin. That was a very insightful session. I'm optimistic about the future of global supply chain, and as a student of management, it was intriguing to hear about what's going on right now, even especially after this COVID. I'm pretty sure we'll be seeing lots of new changes. With that, it's already more than 45 minutes. So let me do this. Let me call Suman for his closing remarks. Suman, are you around? Okay, he's here.
I'm here.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Roshan. Thank you, Roshan, for managing this session. Thanks, Irvin. Without you, we couldn't have done. And I don't know if I have anything to add on supply chain. It's such a pleasure to have you here and to be connected with IDI. And the questions from our audience was amazing. And I know supply chain has been a big topic since the pandemic hit. It was always a big topic, but since the pandemic hit, people are saying, hey, this is real. We all have to pay attention, and because billions of people got impacted since last year, whether it's a food supply or commodity or anything. Like you gave example of computers, and I just read an article not too long ago that all the German motors, motor parts are not getting good supplies in US. So if you have something wrong, if something goes wrong with your German cars, you may have to wait for a couple of weeks for that part to be available. So we are all suffering with this pandemic and social distancing, travel restrictions, and whatnot. So this is the time when people become innovative, right? So I'm glad that you even touched on digitization and etc. And I did see one question was there, and I don't know if we should have asked or not asked. I think Roshan kind of hesitated to ask that question, and but I think that question was pretty real. It said, "Are we out of the frying pan and into the fire?" And I don't know if you are into the fire or not. But and I also don't know if we are out of the frying pan. So let's see, and I'm sure that we will have a lot more opportunities to interact with you going forward. And maybe we build a whole training program around this topic. And Elizabeth, we couldn't have done without you. And thank you very much for putting this together. I know you worked hours with Irvin and also with our participants. And thank you for putting it together. And always thank you, Parshu, for connecting us to Thunderbird Connection. And having, without taking more time, I think we are finishing almost on time. And thank you all the audience for good questions. If you have more questions, we can always email us, and we will pass on those questions to our speaker, and we could mediate the answers to you. Sometime you might have some questions after this session. Please don't hesitate. Thank you. And wherever you are, good afternoon, good evening, have a good day. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Back to you.
Thank you.